Hi, Lou.
How are you?
Good. I'm here representing the oldest people in the world.
And I represent the shortest people in the world.
Right, all right. I'm 72, so I'm completely frightened by this mirror test. But in any event...
And neither of us are James Comey.
In any event, we're happy to be here, and I just want to take a minute. If you don't know about 1871, it's the largest incubator in the United States, probably the world. We have about 2,000 entrepreneurs a day that come to 1871, about 20,000 visitors a month. It's grown from about 50 startups to about 500 startups now. And the name is sort of peculiar. If you don't know, it's the year of the Chicago Fire, which is a little bit like naming your enterprise Titanic Inc. You know, but post the fire, there was a tremendous renaissance, and the Ferris wheel was invented, and the skyscraper and that important food group, the Twinkie, was invented. So we think technology today represents that opportunity, and that opportunity is driven by entrepreneurs and by innovation. And so having these thousands of people come every day to talk about changing the future is really what we do. What's particularly sort of exciting is that we ask them to not just come and talk about making a living, but we require them to talk about making a difference. And so we have a significant number of companies focused on social change and social innovation. And we had a couple of tours yesterday, and one of the things I mentioned, and I just want to share it with you, is we try to put our money where our mouth is. And one of the things that we decided, and as you probably all know, there's no more central food for entrepreneurs than pizza, but we were a little tired of buying 500 pizzas from Domino's every week, nothing against Domino's. So now we spend all that money buying food for our events and TGIFs from minority-owned and operated organizations. And I can tell you that that check each week to a small business is life-changing, as opposed to Papa John's, who really doesn't care whether it's pepperoni or sausage. And what's been so exciting, and this is the sort of the message for today, is that has now grown to where our corporate partners and clients are using these organizations as well. And it's that spark that really permits you to build and to create things that are going to change a much broader and richer landscape than one you can do by yourself. So I'm excited to have Louis here because I hear nonstop about what's going on and how theater has become this enormous engine. And just to give you an idea, I think Wicked ran 3.5 years. Lou is the guy who made Hamilton happen here. We expect that it'll be something north of 7 or 8 years here in Chicago, and about 50% of the people that come are from more than 100 miles away. So it's a huge economic driver. And the biggest part of, sort of our message is that the arts are critical. It's not a nice to have, it's a need to have, but it's also important that they pay their own way and that they be self-sustaining. The city, the state, these aren't going to bail us out. They weren't going to bail out 1871, and they're certainly not going to bail out the arts community. But what's so exciting is the things that he is doing, and that I wanted him to share with you guys today to give you some idea what the future looks like for Chicago. And in addition to being bright and sunny every single day, it's pretty exciting. So tell us just a little bit about, for example, the new cultural festival.
Well, we did a significant body of research about 4 or 5 years ago with the Boston Consulting Group, and we really looked around the world and said, what does Chicago need to make a difference? And really where I play is at this intersection of arts, culture, and economic development. And for me, tourism is that space, and ultimately it's about jobs. The return on investment from a tourism standpoint is very quick. You turn that spigot on and the water comes out very quickly. So there may be other long-term better investments from an economic development standpoint, but nothing is as quick as tourism. So working with BCG and working on what makes a difference for Chicago. Chicago's a great world-class city that the majority of the world doesn't know about, and that's what we're out to change. So the top 12 things that we came up with, contrasting Chicago to the rest of the world, we're working on. They're at different stages of development. And one of those things is a cultural festival that we'll be doing this winter, which is really a way of repurposing some of the existing cultural activities, but harnessing them in a way that's much more powerful. Taking Restaurant Week, taking Theater Week, taking Museum Week, putting music into that package, and creating a lighting overlay. And lighting is something that is also very, very important from a tourism standpoint. Anytime we can align lighting with something else, the value of that something else goes up. If we align lighting with a restaurant, the value of the restaurant goes up. If we take lighting on a restaurant and put it on water, it really goes up. So we've traveled the world looking at lighting festivals, looking at cities that are really pushing the envelope from a lighting standpoint. And we wound up doing running an RFP in Chicago for how to look at lighting in Chicago like no other city in the world. Not to light Chicago like Paris or like Shanghai, but to think about what can be organic, what can be, where are those seeds that we can germinate, and what makes sense for us. And what we wind up finding is there were 110 companies that formed 12 teams that competed in an international design competition to think about lighting. And we've gotten some incredible ideas from around the world from these teams that are just so inspiring. And we look at lighting festivals around the world, and one of the things that becomes very important out of those lighting festivals, at least from my perspective, and you have to understand, I'm rogue. I'm just this asshole that on the fringes that doesn't take no for an answer and just keeps pushing. So the most important thing for me about a lighting festival is that they're a way of lighting a building or lighting a space or lighting a bridge or lighting something on an interim basis. It's a way of showcasing that look into the future that's only there on a temporary basis, and you can get away with it. But it's also a way of building the political support and building the community support around that idea that allows it to grow and allows you to build that team that winds up saying, that's friggin' cool. How do we keep it here? How do we make that happen? All along, that's your game plan. But you're socializing it in a way to pull it off. And that's really been some of the secret sauce we've employed into most everything we're doing.
So our home, the Merchandise Mart, will be the anchor for the first of these lighting tapestries that'll be connected to the Riverwalk. And frankly, I want to just say that it wasn't so many years ago that coming downtown in the evening was an adventure, but not necessarily a good adventure. And between the regrowth of the theater district and all of the restaurants and lighting in the sense that it opens up the whole landscape for visitors and for people from the city as well, it's been pretty amazing. And I think that has to do with what you've done and with expanding the community. One of the other things, and I mentioned the Riverwalk, but tell us about the gondola project, which is completely from outer space.
So, working on an aerial gondola that it would be the first urban aerial gondola of its kind. Gondolas exist on ski resorts all around the world, but nothing like what we're proposing here. This is a $250 million project that leaves Navy Pier, flies 17 stories up, crosses the river, and hugs the river along the Riverwalk for just over a mile and a half. And it's a 30-minute journey that carries 3,000 people an hour. And it really gives you an example of how we're approaching most of the things that we're doing. Any of the naysayers that have come out against that project say, holy crap, how can you pull off, that's bread and circuses while Rome is burning. How can the city spend $250 million on a project like that? Well, the reality is they can't. This is a $250 million project without $1 of city or state money. Sustainability, in my mind, is ultimately about allowing private enterprise that return on investment that allows that to happen. And the aerial gondola is one of those
So we're,
ideas.
and one of the interesting things about the gondola is that from probably 7 in the morning until 9 in the morning, and also from 5 to 7 at night, it'll actually be a transportation vehicle for commuters. And then it'll obviously be a tourist attraction as well. But it's too bad we don't have a visual of this. These are these huge globes. They look like floating bubbles, and it's quite extraordinary. But you mentioned this idea, and I think it's important when we talk about social innovation across any of these things. We think that if you're relying today on Good Samaritans and goodwill and charity, that you can't scale, you can't build an enterprise that's going to have an impact. And this was true of 1871 as well. If it was just a community center, that was never going to be sufficient. What we've done instead is to envision it as an important resource for corporations, for the government, for everyone. And we call this enlightened self-interest. And honestly, I think that social change and improvement is going to come because we work on alignment and we try to focus on things that public organizations can't do and can't afford to do themselves. So we have to figure out strategies for business and for other community organizations to help drive these things. And I think the Pedway is another example of that.
The Pedway, most people that live in Chicago might know there's a Pedway, but they don't know where it is. And if they know where it is, they don't use it because they know what it is. So the Pedway is another one of those lemons to lemonade opportunities. I bring the team together and we say, how can we turn this unused asset in the city into something that's on the top 10 things you need to see, you need to do, you need to experience while you're in Chicago. So, I challenge them, do we create a rain room? And I show them the examples from Tate Modern. What can we do that creates this experience from an art and cultural standpoint that's underground? There's faster ways of getting from A to B than going through the Pedway. But when weather is inclement, there's people that are going to find their way to this. That's one of the reasons that lighting makes sense for us. It gets dark here in the winter at 4 and 5 o'clock in the evening. How do we extend tourism beyond in that day? How do we get people coming in during our off season? The Pedway, it's when people are hiding and trying to get from point A to point B in the rain. How do we reward them for that experience? So when we can engage arts and culture with economic development, there's magic. And that's part of what the Pedway is about.
And just talk a little bit about how the arts drive economic development and impact in terms of, sort of the math of this. I think
let me use the theater district as a case in point. First half of my career was in the concert world. In 2000, I started Broadway in Chicago. Prior to that time, Chicago was known by the industry as a bus and truck town. It was 2 weeks of a show, part of a subscription, and the shows were few and far between. Well, part of the problem was the ownership of the venues that were here were either shuttered because Chicago was not a great theater city, or the one operating theater feared that success of having a long-run show would harm their subscription. You can't handle a subscription if you have a long-run show. And if you don't feed your subscription and you bring in that long-run show, you're putting someone else in business. So we've now acquired 5 venues downtown, and what we now have is, to a large degree, we have shows in a flight pattern waiting for clearance to land as we bring them in and move them from venue to venue. That's what allows us to have Aladdin as running a long-run show in Chicago, or Hamilton on an open-ended run. So prior to Broadway in Chicago, as I said, short runs. Now we do up to 1,700,000 people a year, with up to 50% of our audiences coming from 100 miles away or more. we are bigger than a number of the major conventions in the city combined in terms of its economic input to the city. You know, these are people that are coming in that are making Chicago a destination for that weekend. And part of what we're working on is if Austin, Texas can call themselves the music capital of the world, there's a big friggin' flag we're about to plant in Chicago that speaks to theater. There's a League of Chicago Theaters. We're only 5. We're the guys that make a lot of noise and bang the drums on the top of the mountain. But there's more new work in Chicago than any other theater in the world, city in the world. I mean, some people call this the Silicon Valley for theater because of all the startup theaters here, and it's true. This is a way where they break in. They think they're going to New York, but they make this home.
Okay, I think our time is up. Thank you very much.
Thanks.